Welcome to this Chatham House event where we're going to discuss what was achieved and was not achieved at COP28, the annual United Nations Climate Conference. COP28 was considered of particular significance because, among other reasons, it marks the conclusion of the first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement, which, in layman's terms, assesses how well we're doing in tackling climate change. My name is Chris Taylor, and I'm a research associate in the Environment and Society Centre here at Chatham House in London. I'm delighted to be joined by my colleagues Tim Benton, Ruth Townend, Anthony Froggatt, and Glade Alon, who are all recently back from this 28th Conference of the Parties and are ready to give us their analysis across some of the topics and themes that we follow here in the centre, including climate adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, the energy transition, and food systems transformation. Each of them are going to have 4 to 5 minutes to give us their thoughts. About halfway through the hour we have, I'm going to open the floor up for questions, which you can already start putting into the Q&A box. We're going to try and answer as many as you can, but we've got a pretty packed virtual room today, so please forgive us if we don't manage to get to yours. So to start with, we're actually going to look beyond the shiny conference halls of Dubai and consider the wider geopolitical context, because of course, international climate politics don't take place in a vacuum. We've seen brutal conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza, which have sharply divided the world, and relations between the world's two biggest emitters, the US and China, have deteriorated significantly since the signing of the Paris Agreement back in 2015. So I'd like to turn to you first, Anthony Froggatt. What role has geopolitics played in this year's COP? And looking ahead, how do you see geopolitical factors influencing our ability to confront the climate change challenge?
Great. Well, thanks. And yeah, it's really nice to be in contact with so many people online and yeah, have this chance to discuss with the colleagues. Although we've all recently come back, actually, we haven't seen each other face to face or even had a conversation because people were coming and going at different times. So yeah, good to reflect with everyone. Maybe first thing to mention, which others might comment if it's not true, but one of the things I heard when I was there was that this was the largest ever multilateral gathering in history. So not just within climate terms, but yeah, covering all sorts of issues. So I think that reflects the degree to which it is a cross-society question. And you mentioned some of the issues that we're going to cover today. And in some ways that was reflected within the discussions, and geopolitics and national politics are just part of that overarching discussion. But nevertheless, I think is absolutely vital. And so maybe just in my 4 to 5 minutes, I think, Chris, rather than 45 minutes, is just a couple of points. One is just to flag two things about the geopolitics of the negotiations themselves. Firstly, the extent to which it is done on groupings. So you have the 200 odd countries that are a part of the negotiations, but that is then sort of focused down into 7 or 8 different groups. And so you have these countries or these groupings taking up very specific positions. So like the G77 plus China is obviously a very large, very influential groups. The UK is no longer part of the EU group. It's moved into what's called the umbrella group, which includes sort of Australia, Japan, and the United States. So also significantly is quite powerful in terms of national politics, but also, yeah, reflects a different view. So within the negotiations, you have all of these different groups that are reflective of national positions, but then also international geopolitics. So that's the one thing I wanted to mention. And then the other thing which struck me in particular during the last couple of weeks was obviously the question about who will host it, who will host the next COP. And this is done on a rotational basis. And it's a real example of how geopolitics affects the negotiations, because after the Middle East and North Africa, which was Asia, which was this region's chance to host the COP, which is why UAE did it, it was then going to be Eastern Europe. And then Russia was refusing to accept any country that was part of the EU as a candidate. And then Azerbaijan and Armenia were having a conflict, or still have a conflict, and they were vetoing each other. And it has to be done by unanimity. So it was only in the second week that finally Armenia agreed to back the Azerbaijani presidency. And so they will now host the COP going forward. So an example, I think, in terms of how the geopolitics is affecting the climate negotiations. Just a couple of other things to mention. One is to emphasize what you talked about in terms of the wider geopolitics. You mentioned Israel-Palestine and the war in Ukraine. These are just a couple of examples of where events outside of climate are coming in and affecting the mood, affecting the relationship between the different groups that I've talked about, and actually can have a real-term impact in terms of the direction of travel, because in particular, what we see in terms of the war in Ukraine, the impact that that's had on global energy prices and the impact that it's had on inflation, and therefore both in terms of the energy transition. In some countries that's sped it up, in others it slowed it down, and also in terms of the ability for countries, national governments, to feel that they can contribute more to international coffers because of less national budgets due to the economic situation in their countries. So those are two main issues I'd touch upon. And then maybe the final one, just in the last 30 seconds, was just to mention you have the geopolitical issues, but of course, it's also the national politics. And I think what we will see in 2024 potentially is a very different COP because of developments on the national level affecting the geopolitics. So, for example, the US elections, President Trump, or ex-President Trump, future President Trump, has already indicated that he will withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement again. So if the elections in early November move in that direction, the Azerbaijani presidency, or COP, is the 11th to 22nd of November, will fall after that. So you can imagine how much that will change the discourse within those, that discussion. Similarly, there are lots of elections next year, the EU elections just being another one in which we may see a shift in terms of the views around the importance of climate change. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Anthony. That's really interesting and really good sort of scene setting. I hadn't heard that about it being the largest ever multilateral gathering, but I think that sort of shows how the COP process is not just important for confronting climate change, but also as a kind of symbol of the international order and international kind of multilateral processes and the successes and involved in that and the health of that. So that's extremely interesting. So I'd like to talk now a little bit about the progress made on addressing the impacts of climate change. So that's the question of climate adaptation, but also loss and damage. And both of these have been kind of rising up the agenda in recent years and have been major priorities for developing countries in the run-up. So as you all might have heard, one of the major outcomes of COP27 was an agreement to create a climate change loss and damage fund. And that was a surprise outcome in many ways. And then COP28 opened with again, another surprise announcement that the recommendations of the Transitional Committee had been accepted, which formally established the Loss and Damage Fund. So turning over to you now, Ruth, how do you assess the importance of this new fund? And are there other aspects and progress made around climate adaptation that you think we should be aware of? And what's the sort of prognosis on that?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, certainly it was made a big splash that the COP28 presidency managed to agree the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund on the very first day of the conference. And that's actually an unprecedented win for the presidency. Normally, decisions at COP only come at the very sort of tail end of the conference when we're well into sleepless nights. The Loss and Damage Fund was obviously a really big agenda item at COP28, and the fund was contentious because it was seen by wealthy nations as an acknowledgement of their responsibility for climate change due to their larger historic and current emissions, while developing countries desperately need these funds because they're disproportionately affected by climate disasters. They lack the funds and they have lower resilience to develop in the first place. So the presidency was very proactive on the fund, putting out a draft negotiation text the night before the start of the conference. And remarkably, this was gavelled through in the opening plenary when introduced, and no parties raised objections, to a standing ovation from the assembled parties. So there are a number of things still missing from the fund, however. Firstly, a name. The US, which objects to it being called the Loss and Damage Fund, repeatedly referred to it as a Climate Impact Response Fund, rather than acknowledging it as developing countries would like it to be acknowledged. Secondly, funds. So there were a number of pledges to the Loss and Damage Fund, totaling $792 million during the COP. But these tended to come from existing rather than new budgets, and are frankly a drop in the ocean compared to the scale of the need. They would barely cover a single major climate disaster, let alone the raft of black swan events that vulnerable countries are likely to face in the near future. Thirdly, a permanent home for the fund is missing. So for the first 4 years, it will be housed within the World Bank, which is in itself contentious, as the World Bank is largely controlled by the United States, which elects the president. And also, it doesn't have a great track record of distributing funds where they're needed by developed countries. So it will be overseen by a 26-member board, which is mainly made up of developing countries. So hopefully that allays some of the concerns that developing countries have about the administration of the fund. But it needs to get up and running. It needs to be regularly replenished. And another factor is that the World Bank says it will cost them around $200 million just to get that fund up and running. And where those funds will come from, whether they're coming from grants from other countries, is not yet decided. Over and above the fund, there's also a home was found at COP28 for the Santiago network, which is a network to provide technical assistance or know-how on how to deal with loss and damage. So parties resolved that the Santiago network would be housed within the UN under the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and the UN Office for Project Services. This should enable the fund to begin this should enable the network to begin operating and providing the necessary loss and damage assistance, which developing countries have been sorely in need of for around 30 years now. Loss and damage campaigners were also pleased by the inclusion of a standalone section on loss and damage in the global stocktake cover decision, but that text hasn't made concrete the framing of loss and damage as a third pillar of climate action alongside mitigation and adaptation, which again was something that developing countries wanted to see. So in the kind of hierarchy of climate action, adaptation comes before loss and damage. So you have mitigation, where obviously you hope to avoid any impacts, adaptation, where we seek to ameliorate those impacts, and then loss and damage, where those impacts can't be avoided. And at COP28, we were looking to see the agreement of a framework to serve as the global goal on adaptation, the adaptation equivalent of the 1.5 North Star for mitigation. The need for this goal was part of the Paris Agreement, but the process on defining it has been very slow. And a 2-year work programme was agreed at COP26 to be concluded at COP28, with the outcomes of that up for negotiation. Ambition's long been the poor cousin of mitigation, and developing countries wanted finance to be part of the agreement for the goal. Because achieving any target set under that goal will obviously require investment from them. And these climate vulnerable countries tend to be poorer already and burdened with mitigation and loss and damage in many cases. So the talks on the global goal on adaptation were nearly derailed by this focus on finance, as well as reference to common but differentiated responsibility in line with the respective capabilities, which again, developed countries tend to be reluctant to include because of the implications around their historic responsibilities for climate change. The text that did pass was generally felt to be quite weak, but better than kicking the can down the road yet again on climate adaptation. There's quite a lot missing from it in terms of the targets that were included for the goal are not very smart, so not very specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, or time-bound, but rather perceived to be quite woolly. And now there's a 2-year work programme which has the unenviable task of establishing indicators of progress towards these said rather woolly targets. So while there has been progress made on adaptation, definitely not as much as developing countries particularly would have liked to have seen. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks very much, Ruth. I think it's fair to say a sort of mixed picture. I was really struck by one of the first things you said there, that the funds committed to the loss and damage fund will barely cover a single major climate disaster. And I think that really sort of like highlights the scale of the challenge and how the money we're talking about here is really, really quite spectacularly inadequate at the moment. So moving on to energy, and in particular fossil fuels. So it's fair to say that most of the reporting around this COP has focused on energy and particular fossil fuels. It won't have escaped probably anyone on this call's attention, that COP28 was taking place in a major oil and gas producer, the UAE, and was presided over by Sultan Al Jaber, whose many and varied roles include UAE climate envoy, chair of the Masdar Renewable Energy Company, Minister of Industry and Advanced Technology for the UAE, and most controversially and relevant here, head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. So COP28 ended, as had been widely predicted, with a tussle over the inclusion of fossil fuels in the decision text. Turning to you, Gleda, what language was included here and why does it matter? And can you give us a picture more broadly of the sort of progress or lack on energy and its relation and contribution to climate change?
Try my best, Chris. So yes, this is a big deal. Amongst other things, the text agreed it calls on all parties to contribute to the following global efforts with a few caveats. And one of them is transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly and equitable manner, accelerating action in this critical decade so as to achieve net zero by 2050 and in keeping with the science. That language was really battled over. As you know, there was a huge push to have phase out of all fossil fuels, or rapid phase out, or at least phase down, or something like that. In the text, there were about 130 countries calling for a phase out in the language, with some surprises, including the US, Brazil, EU. There was a huge campaign to get that language in. Now, why is that a big deal? Oil, coal, and gas make up about 82% of our primary energy consumption globally. It's stayed around that level for quite a few years, and they account for 70% of all the human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. So that part's really clear. But in 28 years since the COPs began, the term fossil fuels has not made it into the text. So there's a lot of consternation over this. Coal came in the phrase unabated coal use, phase down of unabated coal use at Glasgow in 2021. But you've still got oil and gas accounting for 40% of all emissions. So there's been various arguments made over the years to keep these out of specific mention. And it's interesting that the UAE, as you mentioned, large major oil and gas exporter, was the place where 197 countries plus the EU agreed to this language. So whilst it might sound weak and caveated, it actually marks a turning point in terms of where we're going with the energy system. And I think, I just really want to stress how important this is for the oil and gas producing countries. If you think back just 5 years ago, no one was talking about what the changes at the international level meant for these producers at the COP. My colleague and I held a side meeting with the African Development Bank on that issue in 2018, and we felt really marginal to the discussions. And you've got over 40 countries really highly dependent on the exports of oil and gas, and some really extremely so, like Iraq and Saudi Arabia and Nigeria. So it's no wonder that they were lobbying hard to make sure phase out was not mentioned in the text. Having said that, they have acquiesced in the text as it is. So I think that's interesting in itself. And also, there's a lot of nuance in producer positions themselves. The the envoy from the largest of producers in the world, the US, was vocal on the need to largely phase out fossil fuels at the COP. Brazil has called for language on fossil fuels through the G20 and again at COP. And then you have Colombia joining the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, committing to phase out. So there's a really interesting rearrangement, I think, of interests around this issue. Oh, you wanted to know more about the wider words on energy. Well, there's actually a lot more on energy this year. Really strong commitment to the tripling of renewable energy to around an extra 11,000 gigawatts by 2030. There's the commitment to doubling efficiency, which is really critical. Actually, let's just talk about that for a moment. So the doubling of efficiency would probably mean like a 10% reduction in energy demand by 2030 over what we have today. So instead of seeing this upward growth path, we would actually see that come down without harming prosperity. The idea is that we de-link it from GDP growth, which has been happening anyway since the Russia-Ukraine crisis in certain countries. Countries can really bring a lot of co-benefits about through efficiency, and I think it really didn't get enough attention in terms of what that should mean at the country level, in terms of targets, for buildings and transport and industry. But I think hopefully, that will lay the groundwork to see that, and a country like our own could be very ambitious. We've already seen declines of say 4% a year in the last 5 years in energy intensity, but we could certainly do a lot more, and it will mean countries that have more capability to retrofit buildings, to clean up transport, really moving a lot quicker than countries with less capacity that don't have so much finance available as we do. So together, the renewable energy and the efficiency targets in this text, they already signal the pathway for fossil fuels reduction in a pretty fast way by 2030. So that in itself is interesting. There's quite a few pointers in that direction, even though, of course, many people were unhappy with the text, some deeply so, especially the island states who saw the lack of strength in the language, the lack of commitment to fossil fuel phase out in a rapid way, as deeply concerning and upsetting for them who face an existential threat from climate change. So there was, emotions were running high in the room by the end of the talks.
Thanks very much, Leila. That's really useful, and I think it's interesting to give a bit of context and go a little bit deeper into what kind of moving away from fossil fuels means. And I think we have a tendency where we sit to kind of think it's all about the big oil and gas sort of super majors, when in fact there are a lot of countries, and some which are not necessarily particularly rich, which are very dependent on these revenues, and they have a different set of interests to sort of consider and impacts.
Right. So the other thing I wanted to mention was it's really good that we have the terms just, orderly, and equitable in there, because it recognizes that there should be, specific timetabled action and assistance on that just, orderly transition, which it has not been discussed, apart from with respect to just energy partnerships, the JETPs for the coal producers, South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam. We'd really want to see those improved and scaled up for other countries who are dependent on oil and gas, but have less capacity to affect diversification at pace and make sure that their economies are stable through transition. Because if we don't work together on this, if we don't cooperate, then we will see a very chaotic, volatile, and unjust transition, which will affect everyone. So it really is in everyone's interest to roll up their sleeves and get on with what it means to move away from such an entrenched system.
So moving on to our final panelist today, we're going to talk about an issue which hasn't necessarily been on the COP agenda very much, but is moving up. And indeed, this year, the UAE presidency vowed that food and agriculture was to take centre stage at COP28. And indeed, it was the first COP to have a thematic day dedicated to food, agriculture and water. So with that in mind, Tim, I'd like to ask you two questions. What happened at COP28 to promote the transformation of global food systems towards sustainability? And do you think the UAE presidency achieved its stated aims of making agriculture and food centre stage for this important conference?
Great, thanks, Chris. So COPs have always historically dealt with the sources of emissions. And in the land use space, the sources of emissions primarily come from land use change and agriculture together. And so that's been the focus for a long time. Over the last 10 years or so, thinking about food systems as a system has become quite common, both in terms of a push from civil society, but increasingly the governments, and the UN hosted the Food System Summit a couple of years ago. And the food system, like the energy system, effectively links up supply and demand. So just as Gleda was saying about energy efficiency as a means of reducing the need for fossil fuels is as important as the production of fossil fuels itself. And the food systems view effectively requires you to link up the supply side and the demand side and say, actually, we can reduce the emissions from agriculture by changing our demands for food, as well as by changing the way that we farm. So that's why food systems have come up the agenda. Food, as many people know, accounts for about a third of all greenhouse gas emissions. So really important. We got a plan for energy, we got a plan for transport. Food was the next kind of big thing on the block. So where was it at COP? Well, we had in the leaders segment the Emirates Declaration on food systems and sustainable agriculture and food systems resilience. That ended up being signed by about 160 countries. And whilst that's not part of the formal negotiated text, it was an important signal that countries were saying they recognise that food's influences climate change and is influenced by climate change in turn. Good signal. There were lots of other things going on that weren't part of the formal negotiated agenda, including we helped launch something called the Alliance of Champions for Food System Transformation, which is a small group of highly ambitious countries co-chaired by Brazil, Norway and Sierra Leone, with other countries involved, who are deliberatively trying to increase the pace of food system transformation and change the art of the possible. So, yes, from an outside view, food was very prominent at COP. But, and here's the but, 160 heads of state signed the declaration. When it comes to where does food appear within the global stocktake, within the formal text, it is only in passing. So there is nothing in the mitigation section of the global stocktake that points directly at food. In fact, the transitioning away from fossil fuels, as Gleda quoted, is transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems. So it doesn't account for heavy industry. It doesn't account for fossil fuel use in producing nitrogen fertilizer, for example. There is a mention of methane within the mitigation section, but agriculture is not called out within that. And in the past, where people have targeted methane, it's largely been from the fossil fuel sector. Where food systems does appear in the declaration is only in the adaptation section. And that is within building resilience in food systems. So it is quite interesting that we've had 160 heads of state saying this is important. And then when it gets down to the negotiated bit, it's hardly there at all. So either the negotiators weren't listening, or the subtext is that governments are quite content with the idea of building today's system to make it more resilient to climate impacts and less interested in the whole issue about what should be grown, how should it be grown, what should be eaten, how should it be eaten. And of course, that is hugely politically difficult. And one can understand the reasons why it has largely been skirted around. But I would hope that in the next cycle of NDCs, where the government signing the declaration have agreed to put food within their NDCs, that at least some governments start tackling the demand side as well. So to answer your second question, yes, food was central to the debate, but it wasn't central to the global stocktake, to the negotiated outcomes in the way that is necessary to get our food system transformation really on course with the 1.5 degree agenda. To do that, we would have to start tackling some of the really thorny issues like reducing meat consumption in the global north, whilst allowing the global south to increase their meat consumption from non-intensive systems. And so it's a bit curate's egg, good in parts, some steps forward. Probably just to sum up, I would say the outcomes are broadly what was expected because it's COP, for all the reasons Anthony said, but not what was hoped. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Tim. That's really useful. And yeah, it was great to see the Alliance of Champions for Food Systems Transformation being launched. That's a fantastic moment. And I think certainly from my perspective as a sort of observer of COP, but someone that hasn't worked extensively on food, it was interesting to see how it was increasingly sort of capturing attention. And we do hope it continues because obviously it's essential to all of us. Yes, so we've now got a bit of time for questions. We've had some great ones coming in. I'm looking through them. I think one thing that sort of, Anthony, did you want to jump in there?
So no, you go through. I'm happy to jump in on some, but I don't know how you want to do it. Sorry, I had to put my hand up too early.
Well, I've got some which have sort of piqued my interest, and I was going to sort of throw at all of you, and we'll sort of see how it goes from there. But if you've got any in particular, please do just jump in. So maybe kick off with the loss and damage fund, which Ruth, you talked about. Silke has made the point that she's basically asked a question which was on my mind as well, which is to what extent can we expect these funds to be additional to existing climate finance and existing humanitarian aid? Is it going to be a case of government sort of just splitting the pie in a different way, or are we likely to see in the way it's sort of set up that it will be an additionality? So that I was thinking of putting to Ruth, but really if Tim, Anthony, Glader, if you've got any sort of thoughts or comments on that, please do jump in.
Yeah, I'm happy to have a go at that. So at the moment, the funds that have been pledged aren't additional. We saw Avinash Prasad, the Barbados climate special envoy, talking about the fact that any pledges made so quickly will have come out of existing budgets rather than new allocation of funds. I think there's a lot of pressure on developed countries to up the ante around climate finance and to find new ways to provide finance to developing countries. And this is something that really isn't optional because of the speed at which we need to make adaptations and also take mitigation actions. Personally, I see one of the key benefits of the loss and damage fund as the fact that the recognition of loss and damage and of the costliness of addressing loss and damage adds sort of credence to this hierarchy of climate action from mitigation to adaptation to loss and damage, and the fact that a sort of stitch in time approach to climate action makes it a lot cheaper to mitigate and to adapt than it does to address the impacts of climate change when we reach the stage of loss and damage. So by creating a fund in which developed countries and, in fact, well, anyone can contribute to the loss and damage fund, as the US kindly pointed out, a fund in which countries can contribute to loss and damage, it demonstrates and raises awareness of the level of the need for loss and damage, and that will only hugely increase if appropriate action is not taken on mitigation and adaptation in the near future.
Thanks very much, Ruth. That's very clear. So I'd like to pass over to Tim. Please jump in.
Yeah, I'd just like to emphasise, as Ruth mentioned earlier, we wrote something earlier in the year and amassed a database up to the end of September of 391 notable extreme weather events last year, any one of which would have taken up the entirety of the loss and damage fund. And with El Nino meaning that 2024 will probably be even worse than 2023, Lloyd's of London have estimated that insurable losses in any given year in the near-term future could be between $1 and $3 trillion per year. So having $500 million in the loss and damage fund is not very much at all a drop in the ocean. So whilst it was lauded and whilst it's a good signal, it doesn't deal with the fundamental issues, the kind of mistrust between the global north and the global south, the inability of the global north to fund transition. There's quite a lot of comment around from the developing world that, yes, we would be ambitious about phasing out fossil fuels, but we need some sort of recompense because that's what our economic livelihood depends on. And so there is a bit of a kind of a flavour of hypocrisy in some of the kind of comments levied at the global north, that we want them to change their behaviour in the global south, but are unwilling to fund how they will do that. And that's also true with the adaptation agenda. So the long-term issues around distrust in between different parts of the world, I think, is not going to go away. And I'd hoped that we would have gone a long way in this COP towards rebuilding some of that trust by making slightly more ambitious progress, but not the case. Over.
Tim, so just to pick up on a point that Tim was making there about kind of lack of trust. There's an interesting question from Max about the role of Russia and China in this COP and to what extent they were blocking or sort of promoting their own interests in a particular way. And I'm wondering if, Anthony, you might want to weigh in on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly an important question, and I think for different reasons. I mean, what I think is a quite significant shift in the geopolitics around climate change over the last year is the extent in which you've had, well, the US Inflation Reduction Act came in August of 2022, but the international reaction to it probably didn't really get going until the end of 2022, beginning of 2023. And that, I think, has put front and center the debate about supply chains, resource nationalism, etc., in the framework of the low carbon transition. So in particular, you have concerns over China in the main and its dominance of low carbon technologies. And I guess the narrative has gone from concerns in Europe over dominance of Russia for the supply of oil and gas and being over dependent on one particular country to being over dependent on a particular country for new supply chains. So that geopolitical debate is very different this year than it was last year. And I think that will continue. I think it raises really important questions about how do you maintain the speed of the energy transition if you want to diversify away from China in particular. So, because obviously China manufactures 90% of the world's solar panels, 90% of batteries for EVs, etc. It is manufacturing 95%, or is currently building 95% of new solar factories around the world. So that dominance is set to increase. And so how does that balance? So China very clearly has an incentive, on the one hand, to accelerate the energy transition because it wants the global markets. So it's pushing in that direction. But interestingly, it was a country, one of the few countries that did not sign the treble times renewables and twice times efficiency target. and that's for different political reasons. So anyway, I guess I'll just say it is very clear that there are interests that want to move ahead in terms of the energy transition, such as China for the global markets. I think Russia is on the other end of that, in which it wants to maintain its market for fossil fuels going forward, and therefore slowing down the energy transition is in its economic interest. So every country is promoting different national industrial interests in light of the energy transition or in light of decarbonisation, one way or another. And I guess that's not surprising. The important thing is to understand it, and that then be reflected in terms of the negotiations, etc.
Thanks, Anthony. Just cycling back a little bit, I saw a question around non-greenhouse gases, and in particular the role of methane. And I know that's something you've worked a lot on, Glader, and I know that in the run-up to COP28, there was a lot of talk about oil and gas companies kind of coming together under the organisation of the COP presidency to, announce some serious measures on tackling emissions from oil and gas production. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that, Glader, methane, where that ended up.
Sure, yeah. And for those of you who don't know, methane is CH4. It's more than 80 times more powerful at trapping heat in the atmosphere over a 20-year time frame than carbon dioxide. So it's shorter lived than CO2, but in a way it's more dangerous for us in the near term. And a huge amount of this gets emitted, chiefly from the agricultural sector. So I'll let Tim comment on that afterwards. And about 40% from the energy sector, where it especially leaks out of oil and gas and coal operations through pipes, through poor equipment, through not plugging wells, all kinds of ways in which that seeps into the atmosphere. So really urgent that we tackle that. And I think there's broad-based agreement as well on tackling methane. You had in Glasgow 150 countries or some signing up after that as well, but they signed up onto the Global Methane Pledge, which commits signatories to cutting those methane emissions from human sources by 30% from 2020 levels to 2030. That obviously needs a lot of help and finance, but the technologies are there. I mean, in the oil and gas sector, emissions can be reduced by over 75% by quite well-known technologies like cameras that show where the methane's leaking and upgrading that and fixing the leaks, basically. So it should be, pretty low-hanging fruit, and it should be done with immediate effect. However, I think early on you had this oil and gas decarbonisation charter, so 50 oil and gas companies that account for about 40% of global oil production committed to eliminating their methane emissions by 2050. But as far as I know, I don't think there were specific cash commitments or interim dates for doing that. And as I say, you really want to see them moving as fast as possible. The US is big on this. They've introduced some fees for methane emissions. They are the third largest methane emitting country after China and Russia. And yeah, you'd hope this really galvanizes what's been talked about for a while, that we need to move fast. And also the data is getting better. That's another interesting sort of context to this is there's now a satellite data that can show you where these methane leaks are occurring. That obviously can be added into the intensity of a barrel of oil or a cubic meter of gas, and so the EU's rules, for instance, that will come in 2030 to limit imports of oil and gas to those which are produced in a way that would be the same as how they're produced in the EU would actually be prejudice against those with high methane leakage and therefore emissions intensity. So yeah, I think it's an interesting move, but perhaps not enough. There's lots of work to be done really on on getting the financing, getting the projects in place to really reduce those leaks at speed.
So yeah, lots of really good questions coming in. I'd like to just ask one on food, because you had some really interesting sort of points about that. So this will be for you, Tim. Bill Grayson says, Tim suggests that the Global South should be allowed to increase their consumption of meat, but that this should be from non-intensive sources. Can you explain a little more what this would look like? And I think more generally, there's another question that I think could potentially be paired with that, which is that why changes to food systems are so politically contentious. So I don't know if you've got some thoughts on that. I'm sure you do.
And I'll wrap it up with the methane question as well. So basically, the more intensive you make agriculture, the lower the emissions per kilogram of product, but the greater the absolute emissions become, because you're promoting greater levels of consumption, in a sense. So in intensive livestock production, what you do is you typically put a whole load of cows together and feed them with grain or other agricultural products rather than with grass. And then in an extensive system, it's much more about the kind of the historical roots of agriculture, which is agroecologicals, diverse mixed farming systems where cattle are part of a rotational on grazing land, in rangelands, low intensity. You're not crowding them together in a feedlot. So it's well acknowledged that in the developing world, the benefits of livestock agriculture from a social and nutritional perspective are not as widespread, perhaps, as they ought to be. An average country in sub-Saharan Africa would eat perhaps 10% of the amount of meat that an average country in the global north would eat. So from a kind of equity perspective, people in the global south perhaps should eat more meat. People in the global north should eat less meat. It's the intensity of livestock production that is the real issue. But that's what most people in the global north depend on for access to lots and lots of meat. About 14% of all greenhouse gas emissions is associated with the livestock sector. The bulk of that is coming absolutely from intensive farming systems. Methane in agriculture, the only mentions I heard of it at COP, not in the negotiated text, as I said earlier, were methane inhibitors. So to be able to feed something to a cow to stop it burping. So very much a supply side issue. The reason that this is entirely contentious, food, is that food is traditionally left to the market. Governments, particularly ones that have swung to the right over recent years, are very nervous in the global north, particularly, of telling people what to eat or being seen to tell people what to eat. And we've had a flavour of that in the UK with Rishi Sunak saying he's going to not develop a meat tax, as though that was ever on the agenda. The National Food Strategy that Henry Dimbleby published a couple of years ago mentioned demand-side issues, and Boris Johnson, on the day it was published, said we're never going to tell citizens what to eat. So intervening in getting a diet healthy for people to mitigate the $9.6 trillion of healthcare that comes from poor diets is not on government's agenda, and they see it very much as a woke issue in many parts of the world. And then, of course, for the global south, what many countries want to do is increase the availability of different foods, and they get very nervous when the global north starts saying, you should not eat this, you should not eat that, because they want to have the freedom to both develop food security, develop nutritional security, and allow citizens in the global south to reap what they would see as the benefits of a modern market that us in the global north have had for a very long time. So food, the culture of eating food, the individual choices in consumption of food, all make it very, very politically difficult, much more so than energy. We don't care when we flick the light switch on where the energy comes from, particularly. We don't typically have a very strong view, but the food that is prepared in the family the food that is eaten, we often do have a very strong opinion on. So politically, it becomes very difficult to think about demand-side solutions to food system emissions. Over.
Thanks very much, Tim. That's great. So I've got lots of questions coming in. It was one of the slightly less reported, but potentially very important kind of developments at COP, was that the Article 6 negotiations on carbon trading all but collapsed. So Aaron Wu's asked if someone is able to sort of offer a commentary on that. I don't know if anyone would like to volunteer. Anthony, have you got any thoughts around that? As I say, it was sort of slightly underreported, but we've had a lot of interest in it here.
Ruth, can you pick it up, or is that?
I'm afraid not. It wasn't one of the areas I focused on.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, we'll have to come back. I'm not sure what the specific rationale or reasons why that area didn't go forward.
Yeah, I think it's testament to sort of how complicated it is, but it made me think generally of the kind of when we're talking about sort of carbon trading, offsetting, and so on, the kind of role of nature more generally in addressing the climate crisis and what are called nature-based solutions. And there's some interesting questions as to whether these processes should wrap nature a bit more tightly into it and encompass it more broadly. As of say, COP, it's the Conference of the Parties on climate change, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Is there scope? Is there a good reason to expand it to maybe include nature? And maybe obviously we've got the other COPs on desertification and biodiversity. So I wonder if anyone's got any thoughts on that particular issue, the kind of nature, the role of nature in it, and if that should be included more tightly. Tim?
Nature is being included more within COPs, and just like food is. The issue is that the Convention on Biodiversity is a completely separate legal entity from the Convention on Climate Change, and climate change has to focus on climate change. We, civil society, have been arguing for a long time we need much greater read across and integration. And there are, for example, IPBES is now, the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, is now doing joint work with the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, to provide the evidential basis for how those two overlap. So increasingly, it will come into the issue, both in terms of needing to protect nature from the impacts of climate change, but also the way that nature, as you said, Chris, is particularly important for potentially nature-based solutions around climate change.
Thanks, Tim. So there's a question on the global stocktake, which we mentioned at the start. That was kind of the hook for this COP. And David Elms points out that we were meant to see some gentle naming and shaming of the progress achieved against the plans submitted at Paris. I think it's true that, this sort of naming and shaming aspect didn't necessarily come through in the media. I wonder if, like Ruth, you'd like to weigh in on that as to the kind of results of this global stocktake process and if that came through sufficiently well.
Yeah, so there was essentially a global stocktake takeover at COP28, where the negotiations around the response to the global stocktake technical report, which came in the autumn of this year, and essentially offered a very poor report card on our progress against the Paris Agreement. This became the sort of central negotiated text of this COP. There was no sort of overarching cover decision as there normally is, but the global stocktake response became that. And I think rather than specifically naming and shaming countries, the negotiations focused more on this need for transformation in action under the Paris Agreement. So while the Paris Agreement has catalyzed a lot of action on climate change and set up a process through which countries can collaborate to work separately but together on increasing ambition and implementation, the global stocktake essentially showed we're not going far or fast enough, and it was hoped that the COP would give a really strong response to this, and in some ways it has, as Gleda was saying, the inclusion of fossil fuel, transition away from fossil fuels is a remarkable achievement by the presidency in many ways. But at the same time, the text that has come out has a lot of loopholes, a lot of potential sidetracks, so it's not as strong as many wanted to see. So you get this sort of contrasting views of some considering the COP a remarkable success and others considering it an abject failure. And in some senses, it is both. It has pushed the agenda forward, but also we are still not going nearly far nor fast enough. And we do desperately need to turn things around in the next 2 years to peak emissions and over the next 7 years to drastically reduce them.
Thanks, Chris.
Sorry, and just one final point. Sorry, Chris.
Please go ahead.
Is that in the negotiated text there were references around the differentiated responsibilities and the fact that developing countries perhaps will not be able to go as far or fast as developed countries, particularly where they lack the necessary funds. But one thing that I felt was missing was reference to the need to compensate for that by developed countries. So if developing countries go less quickly, developed countries need to go much more quickly to achieve the level of ambition that we need. And we've seen, for example, that despite the International Energy Agency requesting, or rather stating, that no new oil or gas exploration could really happen after 2021, well, 1.5 degree target to be kept in reach. We're still seeing new oil and gas licensing rounds, we're still seeing investment in oil and gas, and part from countries such as the US. But part of that is a response to the current situation of crisis regarding Ukraine and Russia's weaponization of oil supplies. But we are living in an era of polycrisis, and leaders need to become accustomed to operating in that situation. And climate impacts aren't going to wait for us to resolve any war. They're just going to keep coming. So yeah, it is a strong response to the global stocktake in some ways, but in other ways, definitely not strong enough.
Thanks, Rick. That's a great summary. And I see we're hurtling towards the hour. We've not got very long left at all. There's so many great questions. There's one in particular about the positions, presence and influence of the UK, which I would have loved to have gotten into, but I see we don't have enough time. So what I'd like to do is offer each of our four panelists final remarks, maybe around a minute each. And we saw questions about the kind of validity, legitimacy and sustainability of the COP process. So maybe, if you like, you could sort of frame your remarks around that, sort of looking forwards. How do you see it? We've had 28. This seems to have ended on a broadly positive note, depends who you are. But I'd be interested to, but equally feel free to end with whatever you think is most important and what you've drawn from it. So maybe, Anthony, we could start with you.
Yeah, thank you. As you said, lots of great questions. Maybe I'd finish up looking forward. I mean, the COP cycles is such that every 5 years, we now have a requirement for countries to pledge their new adaptation and mitigation plans. So this was supposed to be a period in which we would reflect on the existing plans and accelerate the process or accelerate the ambition in order to meet the next round in 2025 when Brazil is hosting. And I guess on an optimistic note, one would hope what we see is the trebling of the renewables, the doubling of the efficiency, the inclusion of food, the transformation in terms of the transformation away from fossil fuels. All of those are raising ambitions within the next round of NDCs. And ultimately, that's what this is about. It is a bottom-up process. And we can talk about what's the high-level statement, countries being welcome to do this, encouraged to do that. Ultimately, it's down to the national countries putting in place policies and measures that can accelerate decarbonisation. And for me, at least, the COP is around creating the confidence, both on the national level, but also on the private sector level, to say that is the direction of travel that we as a globe are going. And therefore, we will make those investments. And I guess that's what we will see. There's one really interesting question about the oil price not being affected by the outcome. And I think, yes, that's in some ways where we need to be looking, is the extent to which the markets are responding to this, and we are then seeing a shift in investment, because ultimately that's what needs to happen, is the shift away from investment in conventional energies into renewables and other energy efficiency measures that we know we have the technologies. I mean, that's the frustrating thing about all of this, is the technologies exist, the measures to implement the technology exist. There's just the political will and the speed, the prioritization of it, that is meaning that we're far off track for the targets.
Thanks, Anthony. Clayton, would you like to follow that?
Sorry, did you say me?
Yes.
Yes, great. Yeah, there's a couple of really good questions, or quite a few brilliant questions in there that we don't have time to answer, you know, on relief and recovery and peace, and on which was a big issue at the COP, and also on that issue of was the tripling of renewable energy looked at in a holistic way, with regard to critical minerals and their impact on the environment. Really, really important questions. I don't think it was, by the way, and I definitely like to be in contact with you individually, maybe afterwards. I wanted to say on the COP process going forward, yeah, it's crazy having this amount of people going every year. And I think what happens with that number, was it over 100,000? It means that people tend to gravitate to those meetings that they know about and that they agree with anyway. So you lack, in terms of the side meetings, you lack the kind of cross-pollination you want to see, and the forcing the right people to talk to each other that you need to see anyway. So I think it should split off much more at the sectoral level. We have a lot of alliances going on right now, and we're involved in some of them, and it would be great to see those alliances taking off on their own, doing a lot of things online, getting things done, really implementing what they've set out to do. And then maybe you have a once a year event, which is a much smaller COP, where countries have to come onto the stage, one by one, and say what they've done, what they've actually delivered on, and what worked. And so share the lessons, but also have to be held accountable. I think that would make it a much more proactive event, because we really don't have time to keep talking and arguing over words that go into a text that doesn't have any teeth.
Excellent excellent sort of vision for the future there, Gleda. Ruth, would you like to go now?
Yeah, I think we've talked a bit about the kind of previously about the kind of spirit of the Paris Agreement, and countries coming with this willingness to engage with the multilateral process and to up the ante on ambition. We talked about how countries have different styles in the negotiations. Some tend to lead with sort of rhetoric about what they will do and what needs to be done, whereas others are more shy in coming forward, but perhaps more focused on delivery. And I think for me, carrying that kind of spirit of the Paris Agreement, the increasing ambition, the almost active competition among countries to go further and faster on climate change, through to the individual countries' actions over the next year and leading up to Gleda's revised COP, would be a fantastic outcome, because it was very clear at this COP that we're not going far or fast enough, and for countries to be able to come into the next COP with their heads held high, that they have been increasing ambition, going over and above what they've pledged, would be a drastic change to the process, I think, and would help restore faith, where in some cases I think it has been quite badly damaged through lack of trust and lack of delivery.
Tim?
Right, I agree with all the above. I might be tired, old and cynical. I think the politics will change, as Hemingway said, gradually, then suddenly. I think it's clear we're passing 1.5 degrees. The long-term signals are there. Hopefully, that gives the certainty that Anthony was talking about from an investment perspective of a direction of travel. I think as more people get sensitized by experiencing extreme weather, people will want more tangible movements. So I think there is a role for these alliances of groups of countries getting together and saying, look, we're doing it, we're driving ahead. And as soon as countries do that, as with many tipping points, once you've got 20% of countries really making progress, then others will follow. So whilst we are a long way behind, there is still hope that we will land somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees of change by the end of the century. And COP is kind of important to that, but it's too big and flabby, as others have said, in its current guise. But who knows how that will develop over the next year or two. Over.
Thanks very much, Tim. Yeah, it's been a really interesting conversation. I don't know about everyone else on the call. I hope you found it interesting as well. It's been a challenge trying to summarize the many things that have gone on at COP and the many sort of themes and actions and pledges. But I think we've done a pretty good job, considering we had a mere 60 minutes, although now we've gone on to 66. So I'd just like to say a big thank you to our panelists, my colleagues, Anthony, Ruth, Tim and Glader, for their insights and analysis. I'd like to say thanks to Raquel, Nina, and my colleagues who've been working behind the scenes to make this event happen. Thanks all of you for joining us today. We'll be following all these themes and more very closely in the coming weeks, months and years, of course. So keep following the work of the Environment and Society Centre at Chatham House to learn more. Wishing everyone a relaxing time as we head into 2024. All the best.